My heart tells me these babies are gone. My heart tells me that.
She was already distancing herself from them, already saying goodbye in her own way. I just didn't recognize it because I couldn't imagine my own daughter being capable of what she was planning. Phone calls between Molly and her mother, some of which Elizabeth had recorded out of concern for her daughter's state of mind, revealed that the performance extended even to immediate family. In one call from May 5th, 3 days after the disappearance, Molly could be heard crying while describing her desperate hope that Lilly and Jack would be found safe. But forensic audio analysis of that recording revealed something disturbing. The crying had a mechanical quality, rhythmic and controlled rather than spontaneous, and chaotic the way genuine grief manifests. And in the background, barely audible, investigators detected the sound of keyboard typing. Cross-referencing the timestamp with computer activity logs recovered from Molly's devices showed she'd been updating a spreadsheet while crying to her mother on the phone. A financial spreadsheet tracking payments related to the conspiracy. She was literally doing accounting for selling her children while performing grief for her mother. The compartmentalization was extraordinary, the emotional detachment complete. Every layer of evidence revealed the same pattern. Molly Brooks Murray had created a performance so convincing that it fooled an entire community, media professionals, trained investigators, even her own family. She'd rehearsed every aspect of her grief until it looked genuine. She'd managed the investigation to keep people searching in the wrong places. And she'd maintained that performance for 5 months while knowing exactly where her children were and what was happening to them. The behavioral analysis team's final report would become required reading for law enforcement agencies across Canada. It detailed every technique Molly had used, every tell sheet inadvertently displayed, every moment where careful observation might have revealed the truth earlier. The goal was to ensure future investigators would recognize similar patterns, would know what questions to ask, would understand that sometimes the most convincing displays of grief are actually the most suspicious. But all the analysis in the world wouldn't bring Lilly and Jack home. That required following the evidence to wherever the children were being held, confronting the people who were hiding them, and executing a rescue operation that would either save 2 lives or confirm everyone's worst fears. The investigation was reaching its critical phase. Arrests were imminent. Tactical teams were preparing to move. And everything investigators had learned about Molly's performance was about to be tested in interrogation rooms where the act would finally have to drop and the truth would have to emerge. Stay with me, because what happens next is the moment this entire case has been building toward. The dawn raids. The confrontations. The desperate search for 2 children who had been missing for 5 months. Make sure you're subscribed because you need to see how this performance finally ended and whether investigators got to Lilly and Jack in time. Comment right now and tell me what you think Molly's first words were when police came to arrest her. Because what she actually said would shock everyone in that room. At 5:47 on an October morning, 6 tactical teams moved simultaneously across rural Nova Scotia. Each team had a specific target. Each target was a property connected to either Molly Brooks Murray or Derek Hammond. And each team carried the desperate hope that they were about to end the nightmare that had consumed an entire community for 5 months. The coordination required was extraordinary. 6 different locations, all needing to be hit at exactly the same time to prevent anyone from warning others if they heard about arrests happening elsewhere. Radio silence until breach. Synchronized watches. Countdown timers. Every officer involved knowing they had one chance to execute this correctly, because if they failed, Lilly and Jack might be moved again, or worse. The primary target was the hunting cabin located nearly 60 kilometers from where the children had disappeared. The property belonged to Derek Hammond's uncle, a man who had passed away 2 years earlier, while the estate was still in probate. Technically abandoned, legally in limbo, perfect for hiding something or someone you didn't want found. Surveillance teams had been watching the property for 72 hours. They documented smoke from the chimney despite the cabin supposedly being empty. They'd recorded vehicle activity, always at odd hours, always brief visits. They'd spotted what appeared to be children's clothing hanging on a makeshift line behind the structure. And most significantly, they'd observed a figure matching Molly's description making repeated trips to the location, always carrying bags that appeared to contain supplies. The tactical team approached through pre-dawn darkness, moving through woods with the silent precision that comes from years of training. They could see light inside the cabin, confirmation someone was present despite the property being officially vacant. Team leader Sergeant Kevin McDonald raised his fist. Everyone froze. Then he pointed forward. Breach formation. Officers moved into position, covering exits, establishing perimeter security, preparing for simultaneous entry through front and back. McDonald checked his watch. 10 seconds.
5, 3, 2, 1.
RCMP, search warrant. The words echoed through the morning air as doors were breached simultaneously and officers flooded into the structure. The main room was secured in seconds. Camping equipment, basic supplies, evidence of recent occupation. But no people. Then they heard it. A sound from the back room. Shuffling. Movement. Someone trying to quiet what sounded like crying. McDonald reached the door first. Protocol called for announcing presence and demanding compliance. But something about the sounds made him hesitate for just a fraction of a second. These weren't the sounds of an armed suspect. These were the sounds of terrified children.
RCMP.
Open the door.
Now.
The door flew open, but it wasn't an adult who emerged. It was Lilly Sullivan, 6 years old, hair cut short and dyed dark, wearing clothes that didn't fit. But unmistakably, undeniably Lilly. And clutched in her arms, his face buried against her shoulder, was Jack. Behind them, pressed against the far wall of the tiny room, was a woman officers would later identify as Catherine Vickers. Her hands were raised, but not in surrender. In a gesture that looked almost pleading. "Don't scare them more than they already are," she said. "Please. They've been through enough." The words were so unexpected that for a moment nobody moved. Then training kicked in. Vickers was secured, separated from the children, moved to a different part of the cabin for processing. Medical personnel rushed in. And the focus shifted entirely to two small, frightened figures who had been found alive after 5 months of searching. The children clung to each other with desperate intensity. When a female RCMP officer tried to approach, Lilly pulled Jack closer, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from months of learning that adults can't be trusted. The officer, Constable Sarah Mitchell, knelt to get on the children's eye level. "It's okay," she said softly. "My name is Constable Sarah. You're safe now. We're going to take you to see your family." At the word family, something shifted in Lily's expression. Confusion first, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Then cautious, fragile hope. "Is Nana here?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Nana. Elizabeth Brooks, the grandmother who had been part of search efforts from day one, who had organized prayer vigils, who had never stopped believing. Lilly hadn't asked for her mother. She'd asked for the grandmother who represented safety and love in ways her biological mother apparently hadn't. "Not yet," Constable Sarah replied gently. "But we're going to take you to her very soon. First, we need to make sure you and Jack are healthy. Is that okay?" Lilly considered this for a long moment, her face showing the calculation of a child who'd learned to evaluate every adult interaction for potential danger. Then she looked down at Jack, who still had his face pressed against her shoulder, and whispered something only he could hear. Jack lifted his head slightly, his eyes huge and uncertain. When his gaze landed on Constable Sarah's kind expression, he nodded slowly. Medical evaluation was conducted right there in the cabin. Moving the children before checking their physical condition could be dangerous if they had injuries needing immediate treatment. Paramedics worked quickly but gently, explaining every touch, every examination, never forcing contact when the children pulled away. What they found was both heartbreaking and somewhat reassuring. Both children were undernourished, not starving but clearly hadn't been receiving adequate nutrition for extended periods. They showed signs of chronic stress, sleep deprivation, anxiety manifesting in physical symptoms. Jack had a healing bruise on his forearm consistent with being grabbed roughly. Lilly had marks on her wrists suggesting she'd been restrained at some point, though the injuries were weeks old, already healing. But they were alive. They were relatively stable physically. And most importantly, they had been found. While paramedics worked, investigators processed the scene. The cabin contained evidence that told the story of what the children's lives had been like for 5 months. Children's clothing in multiple sizes, indicating they'd been moved several times and had outgrown what they'd initially been given. Coloring books and crayons, though most pages were blank, as if the children hadn't had much opportunity or desire to use them. Food supplies that were basic but adequate. And drawings. So many drawings. Created on whatever paper surfaces were available. Brown paper bags. Backs of receipts. Torn cardboard. Each one showing 2 stick figures, sometimes with a larger, darker figure nearby, sometimes alone. One drawing in particular would become evidence that haunted everyone who saw it. 2 small figures holding hands next to a river, labeled in careful childish handwriting, "Me and Jack by River," with a crooked L for Lily's signature. She'd been creating evidence of their presence. A 6-year-old girl, held captive in remote locations for months, still trying to leave traces that someone might find. Still hoping that someone was looking for them. Investigators also found forged documents that revealed how extensive this conspiracy had been. Birth certificates with new names. School enrollment papers listing Catherine Vickers as legal guardian. Medical records claiming the children had been born in Ontario and had lived with their grandmother their entire lives. Someone had created completely fictional backgrounds for Lilly and Jack, documentation thorough enough to pass cursory inspection from schools, doctors, or anyone else who might question their history. The new names were Emma and Lucas Carter. Not even close to their real names. Birth dates had been altered to make Lilly appear younger and Jack older than they actually were. Every detail designed to make these children unrecognizable as the missing Sullivan siblings if anyone searched databases or compared them to Amber Alert photos. Meanwhile, Catherine Vickers was being questioned in another part of the cabin. And what she told investigators would complicate the narrative everyone had been operating under. She didn't present herself as a criminal. She presented herself as a rescuer. Those children were being sold, Catherine said, her voice shaking. Molly and Derek were working with people who don't just relocate kids. They sell them to anyone willing to pay. I found out what was really happening, and I couldn't let it continue. I took Lilly and Jack to keep them safe until I could figure out what to do with them. The claim was extraordinary. Catherine wasn't admitting to trafficking. She was claiming to have infiltrated a trafficking network to save the children. But investigators were immediately skeptical. People involved in child trafficking don't typically develop sudden consciences. And if Catherine had really been trying to rescue Lilly and Jack, why hadn't she contacted authorities immediately? Why had she been moving them between locations, altering their appearances, creating false identities? Because I didn't know who to trust, Catherine insisted. Derek mentioned having contacts in law enforcement, people who made sure investigations looked the other way. If I'd gone to police, I had no way of knowing if I'd be handing Lilly and Jack right back to the network. So I took them and I ran. I've been trying to keep them hidden until I could find someone I was certain would actually help them. The story had just enough plausibility to give investigators pause. Derek had mentioned network contacts in his communications, including people in positions of authority. Could Catherine be telling the truth about trying to protect the children? Or was this just another layer of deception in a case built on lies? The answer would have to wait. Right now, priority was getting Lilly and Jack to safety and reuniting them with family who hadn't seen them in 5 months. The children were carefully loaded into an ambulance for transport to a hospital in Moncton where they could receive comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation. Constable Sarah rode with them, the one familiar face in what had to be an overwhelming situation. During the drive, Lilly spoke for the first time beyond those initial 3 words. She looked at Constable Sarah and asked a question that revealed just how much these children had endured. "Are you going to give us back to Mama?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Constable Sarah chose her words carefully. "Your Nana is waiting to see you. So are your aunts and uncles and cousins. Lots of people who love you very much have been looking for you. We're taking you to them. Okay?" Lilly considered this. Then she said something that would become crucial evidence in the prosecution against Molly Brooks Murray. "Mama said we were going on an adventure. But it wasn't an adventure.
We were scared all the time.
Jack cried every night. And the lady, she pointed vaguely toward where Catherine had been taken into custody. She wasn't mean, but she wasn't nice either. She just kept telling us we had to pretend to be different people, that our real names weren't safe anymore. From a 6-year-old's mouth came truth that adults had spent months trying to obscure. Molly had framed the abduction as an adventure. Catherine had been teaching them to forget their real identities. And through it all, Lilly had been trying to protect Jack, trying to keep her little brother safe in circumstances no child should ever have to navigate. At the hospital, Elizabeth Brooks was waiting. She'd been notified the moment tactical teams confirmed they had the children. She'd driven from Nova Scotia at speeds that would have earned tickets under any other circumstances, arriving before the ambulance. When the doors opened and 2 small figures emerged, Elizabeth collapsed to her knees on the pavement. "Nana." This time it was Jack who spoke, his voice tiny but clear. He pulled away from Lily's hand and ran toward his grandmother with the uncoordinated gait of a 4-year-old who'd been through more than any child should survive. Elizabeth caught him and held on like she would never let go. Lilly followed more slowly, cautiously, as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. But when Elizabeth opened one arm to include her, Lilly finally allowed herself to cry. Not quiet, suppressed tears, but loud, body-shaking sobs of a child who'd been holding everything inside for too long and could finally let it out because someone safe was there to catch her. Medical staff gave the family privacy for those first crucial moments. Procedures could wait. What couldn't wait was letting 2 traumatized children feel safe for the first time in 5 months. Later, after examinations, after social workers had conducted preliminary interviews, after Elizabeth had been briefed on what to expect for the children's recovery, the full picture began emerging. Lilly and Jack had been moved at least 7 times during captivity. They'd been kept isolated, told repeatedly that their family didn't want them, that their old life was gone. They'd been trained to respond to different names, to lie about their background, to suppress any mention of their real family. But they'd never stopped being Lilly and Jack Sullivan. And now, finally, they were coming home. Back at the hunting cabin, investigators were processing evidence that would prove crucial to understanding not just what had happened to the Sullivan children, but how extensive the network behind their abduction really was. Catherine Vickers' phone, once the encryption was broken, contained messages with multiple contacts using code words and burner numbers. Financial records showed payments moving through shell companies and offshore accounts. And perhaps most disturbing, a list of names. Other children. Other families. Other cases that might be connected to the same network. This wasn't an isolated incident. The evidence suggested Lilly and Jack were just 2 children in a larger operation that had been running for years, moving kids across provincial and international borders, erasing their identities, and delivering them to people who wanted children without going through legitimate adoption channels. The investigation that had started with a torn pink blanket had just exposed something far bigger than anyone had imagined. And while Lilly and Jack had been found alive, how many other children were still out there, living under false identities, separated from families who never stopped searching? Those questions would drive the next phase of this investigation. But for now, in a hospital room in Moncton, 2 children were safe in their grandmother's arms. And that victory, however complicated by everything still unknown, was worth celebrating. If you're still watching, you need to understand that finding Lilly and Jack wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of uncovering a network that had been operating in plain sight for years. Make sure you're subscribed because what investigators discovered in Catherine's phone would lead to the largest coordinated operation against child trafficking in Canadian history. Drop a comment telling me what you think should happen to everyone involved in this network. Because justice for Lilly and Jack was just starting. Catherine Vickers sat in an interrogation room, maintaining her story that she'd been trying to save Lilly and Jack rather than traffic them. But as RCMP cybercrime specialists cracked the encryption on her phone, that narrative began to crumble like wet paper. The encryption was sophisticated, designed by someone who understood digital security and wanted to avoid law enforcement surveillance. But RCMP specialists were better. Within 18 hours, They'd gained access to months of communications that revealed the true scope of what investigators were dealing with. Catherine hadn't been a rescuer. She'd been a key operative in a network that had been operating across eastern Canada for at least 5 years. The messages were coded, but not well enough to hide their meaning. References to packages being delivered, inventory being transferred, clients being satisfied with acquisitions. Each euphemism mapped perfectly to the trafficking and sale of children. And Catherine's role was exactly what Derek Hammond had described during his interrogation. She was a transporter, someone who moved kids between stages of the operation while keeping them hidden from potential witnesses. But the messages also revealed something that made investigators' blood run cold. Lilly and Jack weren't the first children from Nova Scotia that Catherine had transported. 2 years earlier, there had been messages about a different situation, a different family, different children who had been successfully moved through the network and delivered to their final destination. Those children had never been found. Their case had eventually gone cold, filed away as an unsolved disappearance with no leads and no closure for the family. But now investigators had evidence suggesting what had really happened. They'd been trafficked through the same network, moved by the same people, erased by the same system that had almost claimed Lilly and Jack. The list found on Catherine's phone contained 23 names. Children ranging in age from 3 to 12. Each entry included basic information: age, physical description, location where they'd been taken from, and a date. The dates ranged from 5 years ago to as recent as 3 months before Lilly and Jack's disappearance. 23 children. 23 families who had experienced the same nightmare as the Sullivans. 23 cases that might finally have answers if investigators could decode where these children had been taken and whether they could still be found. The messages also revealed the structure of the network itself. Catherine reported to someone identified only as coordinator in the communications. This person gave orders, arranged logistics, handled financial transactions. Below coordinator were multiple operatives like Catherine, each responsible for different aspects of the operation. Scouts who identified vulnerable targets. Facilitators who arranged initial abductions. Transporters who moved children between locations. Document specialists who created false identities that allowed trafficked kids to disappear into new lives. The operation was sophisticated, compartmentalized, designed to survive even if individual operatives were caught. Each person knew only their specific role and direct contacts. If one was arrested, the network could continue operating with minimal disruption. It was a system built for resilience and longevity, but it had one weakness. Coordinator needed to maintain communication with all operatives to manage the complex logistics of moving children across provincial lines while avoiding detection. And those communications, even encrypted, created a digital trail that investigators could follow backward to identify the entire network. The phone number associated with coordinator had sent messages to 7 different people, including Catherine. Each of those people had their own networks of contacts. By mapping the communication patterns, investigators began identifying the full scope of the organization. They weren't dealing with a small group of criminals. They were dealing with an operation that involved dozens of people across multiple provinces, all working together to traffic children. Federal agencies were brought in. RCMP units specializing in organized crime began coordinating with child exploitation specialists. A task force was assembled with one mandate: dismantle this network completely, recover any children who could still be found, and bring every single person involved to justice. The investigation expanded rapidly. Financial forensics traced offshore accounts back to their sources. Surveillance was established on known associates of identified operatives. And carefully coordinated arrests were planned to happen simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions, preventing network members from warning each other once operations began. But investigators also faced an ethical dilemma that kept them awake at night. Some of the children on that list had been missing for years. If they'd been placed with families through this network, they might not remember their original identities. They might have bonded with the people raising them, might consider those people their parents. Removing them from the only homes they remembered, even homes they'd been illegally placed in, could cause additional trauma to kids who had already been victimized once. How do you balance the need for justice with the psychological well-being of children who don't remember being stolen? How do you reunite a child with biological family they have no memory of without making them feel like they're being taken from the only parents they've ever known? Child welfare specialists were consulted. Trauma counselors provided guidance. And a protocol was developed. Locate the children first, assess their current situations, evaluate their psychological states, and make individualized decisions about what would be in each child's best interest. Some might need immediate removal from dangerous environments. Others might require gradual transitions with extensive therapeutic support. And in some cases, the most humane choice might be supervised contact with biological family while allowing the child to remain in the only home they remembered, provided that home was safe and the placement had been made unknowingly by people who genuinely believed they were adopting legally. There were no perfect solutions. Only attempts to prioritize each child's well-being while still pursuing justice for crimes that had destroyed families and stolen childhoods. Meanwhile, Molly Brooks Murray and Derek Hammond were facing additional charges as the full scope of their involvement became clear. Molly hadn't just sold her own children. Messages found on her devices showed she'd been actively recruiting for the network, identifying other vulnerable families, other mothers struggling with financial problems who might be convinced to make the same terrible choice. She'd reached out to at least 5 other mothers in similar situations, planting seeds about solutions that didn't involve conventional channels. 2 of those mothers had declined, disturbed by the suggestions. 3 had moved forward, resulting in additional children being trafficked through the network. Molly had been paid a finder's fee for each successful recruitment. Derek's role had been larger than initially understood. He wasn't just a facilitator for the Sullivan case. He'd been involved for at least 3 years, providing logistical support for multiple operations. His construction business had been used as cover for moving equipment and supplies. The uncle's hunting cabin where Lilly and Jack had been held was just one of several properties Derek had made available to the network over the years. Financial records showed he'd received over $200,000 in payments from the network during that 3-year period. This wasn't someone who had helped a friend in need one time. This was someone who had built a criminal enterprise, who had profited substantially from trafficking children, who had shown no concern for the lives he was destroying as long as the money kept coming. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators identified coordinator. The phone number had been carefully traced through multiple layers of security and misdirection. It led to a woman named Patricia Morgan, though she'd been operating under multiple identities, including names that closely mimicked law enforcement personnel to create confusion if her communications were ever intercepted. Patricia Morgan was a former social worker who had been fired from Child Protective Services 8 years earlier for falsifying adoption records. She disappeared from public records shortly after her dismissal. Investigators had assumed she'd left the country. Instead, she'd been building a criminal network that exploited the very system she'd once been part of. Patricia understood how child welfare systems worked. She knew their weaknesses, their blind spots, how to create documentation that would pass inspection from overworked caseworkers. That expertise had made her invaluable to the trafficking network and had allowed the operation to flourish while avoiding detection for years. Her arrest happened on a gray November morning in a suburb of Halifax. Tactical teams surrounded her residence at dawn. When they breached the door, they found her calmly destroying evidence, feeding documents through a shredder while software ran on her computer designed to wipe hard drives. She'd known law enforcement was coming and had prepared to erase as much as possible. But she couldn't destroy everything fast enough. Investigators recovered partially shredded documents, computers with data that could be reconstructed, and most importantly, a handwritten ledger that Patricia had kept as backup. It was old school, the kind of physical record that couldn't be remotely deleted. And it was a complete accounting of 5 years of child trafficking. The ledger contained names, dates, amounts paid, locations. Every child who had gone through the network. Every person who had facilitated their trafficking. Every family who had purchased a child through this system. It was evidence that would lead to dozens of additional arrests and provide information needed to locate missing children who had been gone for years. But reading through that ledger was one of the most emotionally difficult tasks investigators had ever faced. Each entry represented a child whose life had been stolen, a family destroyed, a crime that had gone unpunished until now. And the clinical, businesslike way Patricia had recorded these transactions, as if children were inventory rather than human beings, revealed the sociopathic mindset that had allowed this network to operate. 23 children on Catherine's list. 47 children in Patricia's ledger. Some overlap between the lists, but many new names that hadn't appeared in Catherine's records. The scale was staggering. Nearly 50 children trafficked over 5 years through a network that had operated across Atlantic Canada while law enforcement remained completely unaware it existed. The task force expanded again. International agencies were brought in because some children had been moved across borders